he walked into a burning building to save the son of a man who would never shake his hand on the street. This is the story of Marcus Johnson, a black firefighter from Charleston, known among his colleagues for unwavering courage and for carrying more scars on his soul than on his body. Marcus had seen it all: fires, impossible rescues, cold nights returning home with the smell of smoke deeply ingrained in his skin. But that afternoon, something was different. The sky seemed to conspire with disaster. Gray, heavy, and loaded, it was collapsing into smoke even before the rain fell. The thick cloud spread like a coal blanket, blocking the sunlight and plunging Charleston's historic downtown into a suffocating gloom. In the heart of King Street, a 3-story commercial building was engulfed in flames. The surrounding colonial facades, with their wrought iron balconies and arched windows, reflected the furious orange fire. Shattered glass glittered on the ground like fragments of a nightmare, while the flames roared like a hungry beast, spewing heat and sparks into the wind. The smell was almost tangible, a mix of burning old wood, melting plastic, and paint blistering off the walls. Every breath burned from within. On the narrow streets, people gathered, forming a semicircle of tension. Men, women, tourists, and locals watched in silence, broken only by sirens, firefighters' radios, and the crackling sound of fire devouring everything. Some filmed on their phones, others simply wept. And it was there, in the middle of the crowd, that Marcus saw him. A white man, dressed in an expensive suit now rumpled and stained with soot, was pushing people aside in desperation. His eyes, light cold, always haughty at Chamber of Commerce meetings, were now wide with terror. "Lucas, Lucas, where are you?" His voice broke. "My son. Please, someone." The irony did not escape Marcus. He knew who that man was. Richard Hale, an influential businessman, a local columnist, admired by some, and known for his subtle opinions about people like Marcus. At public events, Hale spoke of order and security, as if they meant keeping black people at a distance. Marcus remembered once years ago when he tried to greet him after a community ceremony. Hale didn't even offer his hand. He merely nodded and walked away, as if Marcus's touch was something to avoid. But now, there were no microphones, no cameras, no rehearsed speeches. There was only a father begging, and a boy trapped in a hell of fire and smoke. While other firefighters assessed the unstable structure, Marcus adjusted his oxygen mask and tightened his helmet. No one had to say a word. He knew he had to go in. Because sometimes, the most dangerous fire isn't the one that destroys walls. It's the one that eats away at hearts. And Marcus was about to face both. His words cut through the air like blades, sharpened by urgency and fear, tearing through the heavy silence between sirens and the roar of the flames. Every phrase sounded like a last plea, as if life itself depended on them. Richard Caldwell turned his head back and forth, desperately searching for someone's eyes, anyone's, to give him the certainty that his son was still breathing. He looked like a ship adrift on a stormy sea, expensive, polished, accustomed to calm waters, yet completely vulnerable against the tempest now swallowing him whole. That man, so confident in boardrooms and charity dinners, was now just a father on the brink of collapse. The ground, soaked by the water sprayed from the fire trucks, reflected the unstable glow of the flames in dancing patches of orange and red across the asphalt. The smell of smoke was invasive, entering nostrils, clinging to skin, and burning from within with every breath. It mingled with the metallic scent of treated water and burning electrical wires, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. "My son is in there," he shouted, his voice choked with despair. "Someone needs to save my boy." The words echoed through Charleston's narrow streets, ricocheting off historic red brick walls and wrought iron balconies. The heat radiating from the burning building was so intense it seemed to push people back several steps, forcing them to keep their distance. But Richard did not step back. He stood close to the curb, fists clenched, his face flushed from both heat and tension. His white shirt, once pristine, now clung to his body, stained with sweat. His tie hung crookedly, as if representing the unraveling of the self-control he had always maintained. The dark suit, a symbol of power and status, seemed out of place there, wet at the hems, speckled with ash, wrinkled from haste. Around him, the scene was a cruel contrast. On one side, the worn elegance of a man who had always seen himself above the chaos. On the other, the raw devastation of flames engulfing a century-old structure. The neighboring facades, with their arched windows and peeling paint, reflected the firelight as if they too were burning from within. People squeezed onto the sidewalks, mothers clutching their children, confused tourists filming videos, elderly onlookers with tear-filled eyes. The sound was a chaotic chorus, radios crackling orders, boots pounding on asphalt, the steady spray of hoses, and the loud creak of beams succumbing to the heat. Richard Caldwell, used to commanding attention in any room, was now completely powerless. And oddly enough, to some who knew him, that vulnerability carried a bitter sweetness. He was the man who had so often belittled people like Marcus, and who now depended, unknowingly, on a man like him to save what he loved most. But at that moment, there was no politics, no veiled remarks, no reputation to protect. There was only a father, and a boy trapped in hell. And while chaos reigned, there was something in the air that did not come from smoke. It was a silent hope, almost imperceptible, yet so dense it seemed to have weight. A hope that, in that instant, took form, and wore a firefighter's uniform. The red fire truck screeched to a halt, and 5 men jumped from the back, like pieces of a perfectly tuned machine. But there was one among them who caught the eye, without saying a word. Marcus Ellis. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a firm stance. The firelight reflected off his black, polished ebony skin, creating an almost hypnotic contrast with the blazing orange flames. His face was partially covered by the oxygen mask, but his eyes, those eyes were impossible to ignore, alert, precise, piercing. The eyes of a man who had faced the impossible before, and won. The uniform, thick and heavy, was already soaked with sweat before his first step. Every fiber seemed to carry the sharp smell of smoke and the metallic taste of danger. Around him, the heat was like an invisible wall, pushing back anyone who dared come close. The air shimmered, distorting shapes, while the asphalt beneath began to show signs of melting under the intense heat. From above, shards of glass fell like tiny transparent blades, drifting slowly down and shattering on the wet ground. Pieces of charred wood floated down like black flakes, still burning to the touch. The fire roared, alive, predatory, ravenous, devouring every inch of the building. The other firefighters divided their tasks. One stretched out hoses, another positioned ladders, another checked the water supply. But Marcus wasted no time on glances or words. The call was clear: a child trapped on the 3rd floor. Less than 7 minutes remained before the extreme heat would compromise the entire structure. He stepped toward the entrance, as if crossing a portal into another world. The smoke there had turned almost solid, swallowing every trace of light. The shadows of the flames danced on the walls like hungry creatures, twisting and distorting space. Each step on the burned floor was a test of trust between the weight of his body and the fragility of the wood. The sound was a sharp creak, followed by crackling noises like breaking bones. The old varnish had turned to brittle charcoal, flaking off and sticking to Marcus's boots. The stairway to the 2nd floor trembled, as if it were breathing, alive with pain. Streams of hot air rose through the cracks, burning exposed arms, and with each step the temperature seemed to double. But Marcus didn't stop. He knew hesitation cost more than seconds. It cost lives. And somewhere up there, in the middle of that labyrinth of smoke and heat, a boy was alone. Marcus wasn't going to let him stay that way for much longer. Whole sections of the railing had already turned to charcoal, leaving only twisted shadows that creaked at the slightest touch. Above, the ceiling gave way in sudden bursts, releasing glowing chunks that fell like miniature meteors, scattering sparks and clouds of dense smoke. The heat was more than physical. It pressed on the mind, crushing logic and calm in anyone who dared face that inferno. Every breath was a challenge. The air, saturated with smoke, seemed to steal more oxygen than it provided, burning the throat and scratching the lungs. The building had become a suffocating maze where every corner hid new dangers. and where cruel times slipped away faster than the fire consumed the walls. Marcus moved as one who already knew this kind of battle. His senses were on high alert, filtering every sound. And then, amid the roar of the flames and the crackling of failing beams, he heard it. First, a faint sob. Then, a dry cough. And finally, the soft sound of a foot scraping against the floor. Small signs of life, too fragile to be ignored. The third floor lay in ruins. The bedroom door had fallen, burned and twisted. The walls, once painted light blue and adorned with colorful stickers, were now gray, stained with soot, cracked deep. A fallen lamp flickered intermittently, as if resisting the command to go out. Dolls and stuffed animals were warped by the heat. Toy cars had melted into shapeless pools of plastic. Everything stood as silent witnesses to the fire's violent destruction. And then he saw him. In the corner of the room, almost hidden behind the fallen frame of a dismantled bed, a boy, no more than 6 years old, was curled up, his body folded over his knees. He trembled. He coughed. His face, smeared with ash, gleamed with fresh tears that cut through the dirt in thin trails. His eyes, red from the smoke, were two beacons of pure fear, the kind of look no child should ever have to carry. Marcus bent down slowly, his movements controlled, careful, like approaching an injured bird. He opened his protective jacket and wrapped the boy, covering him as if shielding him not just from the fire, but from the world itself. The boy clung to him with the grip of someone holding on to the last plank in an open sea. "You're going to be okay. I promise you will," Marcus said, his voice deep but steady, carrying a certainty that left no room for doubt. At that moment, the words did not come from a man in the flames. They came from an angel in the middle of hell. But getting out would be even harder than getting in. The stairway that had led him to the third floor was partially destroyed. The fire licked the walls fiercely, as if trying to block every escape route. The smoke had grown so thick that every step was taken in suffocating darkness, and the heat pulsed as if it had a life of its own, pressing in on them from all sides. Above them, pieces of the ceiling continued to fall, now more frequently, clinking on the floor or bursting into small flames when they touched flammable surfaces. The floor creaked and vibrated, ready to give way. The building no longer wanted to resist. And Marcus knew, they either left now, or they wouldn't leave at all. The air, already thin, and carrying a bitter taste of ash and charcoal, invaded every breath like a silent warning of the danger still present. Marcus adjusted his helmet with steady fingers while holding the boy close to his chest, a gesture filled with all the strength and promise of that moment. His heart pounded fiercely against his ribs, each beat a war drum marking the urgency of the rescue. The boy, exhausted and caught between fear and relief, no longer cried. Maybe he had given in to fatigue, or maybe, at that moment, he found in Marcus's firm and silent presence a safety no words could convey. His small fingers gripped the fabric of the uniform, as if his very life depended on that contact. And indeed, it did. Outside, time seemed to stand still. The gathered crowd watched every move with fixed gazes, hands clasped in silent prayers seeking strength for a miracle. The sound of sirens still echoed in the distance, mingling with the persistent roar of the fire and the urgent commands of the firefighters. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could dissolve the weight of the tension hanging in the air, a silence heavy with both hope and fear. And then, like an apparition emerging from the depths of the smoke, he appeared. Marcus's silhouette cut through the thick haze, steady and resolute, the boy cradled in his arms. Every step was an act of pure bravery, a dance between life and death. His uniform, stained with soot and sweat, reflected the pulsing red lights of the fire truck behind him, like halos of fire and hope illuminating this unexpected hero. For a moment, time froze. Sound stopped. Movement ceased. It was as if all of Charleston held its breath, witnessing the arrival of a miracle in human form. Then, the scream broke out. A pure sound of relief and disbelief that spread through the crowd like a breath releasing a long-held burden. The boy was carefully handed into the arms of a kneeling paramedic, ready with a stretcher and equipment. The professional's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the deep awareness of how close that life had come to the edge. A rescue measured in seconds, fueled by courage, by a man who refused to retreat. Richard Caldwell, who until then had stood still like a statue, shattered by grief, broke through the crowd with hurried steps, eyes drowned in almost childlike desperation. His tie flew in the wind. His shirt clung to his body, wet with sweat and anxiety. But as he approached his son, something stopped him. He froze halfway. There, just a few meters away, the father saw the man who had crossed fire to save his boy. Marcus's eyes, still marked by smoke and struggle, met Richard's. No words passed between them, because in that gaze was something far greater than any speech could contain. There was no pride or challenge in Marcus's gesture. Only humanity, raw, deep, undeniable. And in that silence heavy with smoke, heat, and emotion, something invisible began to break. "Was it you who?" Richard murmured, his voice choked, as if struggling to believe what he saw before him. Richard Caldwell was no longer the man who, minutes before, had screamed desperately, his voice slicing the air in panic. Now, standing just steps from Marcus, his features were frozen in a mix of contained astonishment and profound shock, a silence that weighed far heavier than any words could carry. It was as if, right there inside that body used to control uncertainty, something had finally cracked, or begun to shatter. An invisible wall, built from years of prejudice and hidden convictions, started crumbling before that palpable, inescapable truth. His voice came out low, hoarse, and rough, carried not only by the smoke still thick in the air, but by the overwhelming weight of what his eyes stubbornly tried to process. It was not just disbelief. It was the brutal collision between an old worldview and the vivid, relentless reality Marcus embodied. Marcus stood firm, motionless despite the exhaustion weighing on every muscle. Sweat ran down his temples, mingling with the soot that stained his face, but in his eyes was a profound calm, a timeless serenity that only those who have faced both visible and invisible battles could possess. He tilted his head in a subtle gesture, heavy with dignity and meaning, then spoke, his voice steady, yet without aggression, like one planting a seed with the hope of a different future. Every father deserves to see his child grow, and every child deserves to be saved regardless of the color of the one who runs to save them. Simple words, yet sharp as silent blades cutting through the smoke and the surrounding silence. And then silence returned, dense, almost tangible, like the fine dust still floating in the air thick with soot. The sound of the fire began to give way to the aftermath, that fragile pause between chaos and relief, when the city seemed finally able to breathe again. The late afternoon light filtered through the smoke clouds in trembling golden beams, illuminating the two figures, as if Charleston itself was granting a silent blessing to that moment. The crowd's gazes, once fixed on the flames and destruction, now shifted toward them. The firefighter covered in soot and sweat, and the businessman in a wrinkled, sweat-stained suit. Two distinct worlds, separated by social, racial, and cultural barriers, now united in a moment that no color, class, or belief could deny. The saved life of a child. In that instant, nothing else moved, not words, nor gestures, nor even the air seemed to flow freely. There was only truth, suspended in the space between them, a silence heavy with emotion, regret, and hope. Richard Caldwell said nothing. He stood there, motionless, looking at Marcus not just as a man, but as a painful mirror, reflecting back everything he had avoided, denied, and silenced throughout his life. And in that stillness, which spoke louder than any speech could, that was enough. Some lessons don't need to be shouted. They settle into the silence left behind after an act impossible to ignore, a silence that speaks louder than any words ever could. Time, patient and relentless, passed. Gradually, the traces of that devastating fire were erased by reconstruction. Months later, the building that had once been consumed by flames rose again, not just as a physical structure, but as a living symbol of a community's renewal, refusing to bend before fire and prejudice. The facade, once stained black and gray, now displayed a clear, vibrant tone, with new, sturdy bricks carefully laid. as if the city had decided to rebuild not only the building, but also the very consciousness and hope of its people. The windows sparkled under the morning sun, reflecting a clear and promising sky. Around the main entrance, carefully planted flowers breathed life, white daisies that seemed to whisper peace, yellow chrysanthemums carrying the warmth of hope, and small red roses whose tenacity reminded all of the strength and resilience of those who lived there. Each flower was a small tribute to endurance. Near the new tempered glass door, a bronze plaque was respectfully mounted. It gleamed in the golden light of dusk, discreetly catching the eye of passers-by. Simple, without adornment or excess, yet the weight of that ancient metal, combined with the firmness of the hand-engraved letters, seemed to capture attention and hold the mind. Engraved on it was, "To those who face the fire outside and within themselves, and still choose to save." There were no names, no photos, no dates, because this tribute didn't need any. It was for everyone who, even in darkness, refused to give up. Visitors would pause for a few seconds before the plaque. Some maintained a reverent silence. Others bowed their heads in a deep gesture of respect. Some even placed their hands over their hearts, as if that small piece of bronze touched something inside their soul, something no ordinary words could reach. The wind blew softly, carrying the fresh scent of newly watered flowers. The distant sound of cars mingled with the timid song of a bird hiding high on a power line. The city moved to its relentless, pulsating rhythm, but something within it was no longer the same. Because sometimes a fire destroys walls, but other times it ignites consciences. Marcus Ellis never sought recognition. He didn't pose for photos or give interviews. On that night of fire and fury, while the city spoke his name with admiration and surprise, he quietly cleaned his uniform. He removed the soot and ashes, but he couldn't wash away the memories, nor the emotions forever etched in his soul. At the firehouse, with its weathered red brick walls and the slightly rusted metal sign, he found refuge. There, the smell of grease, smoke, and stale coffee mixed with the constant murmur of radios whispering emergencies and the hurried pace of boots echoing down the hallways. Marcus carried on with the same posture, centered, alert, and discreet. But to those who knew him well, something had changed. It wasn't pride. It was an inner light. The silent, unshakable certainty that on that day he hadn't just saved a life. He had ignited a flame that didn't burn, but illuminated. What Marcus did that day was more than a common heroic act. He burned away a man's prejudice until nothing remained but ashes, ashes that spread silently, but with unstoppable force, to every corner of that city. It wasn't a fiery speech, nor a heated argument. It was action, the purest, rawest, and most powerful demonstration of humanity possible, protecting a life. A life that seconds before belonged to someone who would never have extended a hand to him. That truth echoed through the streets of Charleston like a whisper that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. Residents passing by the rebuilt building began to see it and everything it represented with new eyes. There was a silent, almost reverent respect in how they looked at the bright facade, the neatly aligned bricks, and the carefully planted flowers around the entrance. Even the most skeptical walked slower as they passed the bronze plaque, as if that cold metal carried the heat of a lesson too difficult to forget. When the wind blew and touched the bronze, it emitted an almost whispering sound, a constant reminder that powerful forces can break ancestral cycles. And those forces don't always come from above, from some distant power or institution. Sometimes they come from someone willing to refuse to leave another human being behind, no matter the cost. Marcus taught, in a way no lecture ever could, that a person's value isn't in the color of their skin, nor in titles, nor in the shiny appearances society insists on valuing. True value lies in the courage to protect, in the strength to act, in the determination to save, even those who have yet to see beyond their own fear and ignorance. Richard Caldwell was never the same man again. He continued attending the same circles, wearing his expensive suits, driving his imported cars, appearances he never abandoned. But there was something different in the sparkle of his eyes. Something subtle, almost invisible to those who didn't truly know him. Those close enough to notice realized that the man who once boasted of unfounded superiority now listened more than he spoke. He thought more than he opined, and from time to time remained silent on topics he had previously addressed with arrogance disguised as conviction. Richard was never seen publicly thanking Marcus, and he didn't have to, because true change doesn't happen in the spotlight. It happens quietly, behind the scenes of consciousness. Years later, an anonymous support fund emerged in the city, dedicated to training young firefighters from marginalized communities. Curiously, among the main donors was a name that stood out: Caldwell. Nothing was declared. Nothing was officially confirmed. But everyone knew. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his journey as always, serving. He arrived early at the firehouse, led training for the rookies, participated in prevention campaigns, and occasionally visited schools to teach children how to avoid fires. The children adored him. Adults respected him deeply, and his fellow firefighters followed him, not out of obligation, but out of genuine trust and admiration. Marcus Ellis didn't just save a child that day. He ignited a light, a flame of courage, justice, and humanity that would shine far beyond the rebuilt walls of that building. On a hot, sunny morning, right after a lecture at a public school in the outskirts of Charleston, Marcus was leaving the building with steady steps, but a heart still heavy with the challenges he carried. The sound of students running and playing filled the yard, a noise full of life and hope, contrasting with the difficult stories he had just shared with those children minutes before. Then, amid the crowd of young voices, a black boy approached with a shy smile and bright eyes, full of curiosity and admiration. He was about 8 years old and carefully held in his hands a drawing made with colored pencils, lines shaky from a still-learning hand, but expressing more than words ever could. On the paper, a tall, imposing figure dominated the scene, a firefighter, helmeted and in heavy uniform, holding a child in his arms in front of a burning building that seemed to blaze with an almost living fury. The flames danced in vibrant shades of orange and red, while gray smoke spread across the blue sky behind the image. At the top of the drawing, in crooked and colorful letters, written with the enthusiasm and innocence of a child, was the phrase that touched Marcus the most at that moment: "My hero is the color of my dad." Marcus's smile grew, a mixture of quiet pride and contained emotion. He didn't say a single word. Carefully, he tucked the drawing inside the folder he carried, as if protecting a precious treasure, not just a piece of paper, but the hope and recognition those words carried. Marcus walked away, his steps lighter, carrying with him a certainty no court could decree, no law could guarantee, and no book could teach so well. Not all justice is done in courts. Not every lesson comes from books. And not every hero needs a cape. Sometimes, all they need is courage to walk into the fire and come out with more than one life saved. He carried with him a profound truth, echoing inside him, loud and clear. The color of your skin may bother some, but your worth? That no one will ever be able to erase. Days passed, the seasons changed, and the city of Charleston slowly rebuilt itself, brick by brick, hope by hope. But the true reconstruction wasn't happening only in the streets. It was taking place in the hearts of its people. Marcus continued his work quietly, never seeking the spotlight, guided only by the conviction that his mission went far beyond putting out fires. He was igniting something much greater, a flame of change that began to burn through small actions, through attitudes that transformed prejudice into respect, ignorance into understanding, and fear into courage. Richard Caldwell, for his part, kept that memory. The image of a black man who walked through flames to save his son, a truth he could no longer deny, as a revealing secret that slowly changed his worldview. Quietly, he began supporting initiatives he once dismissed, investing in opportunities for young people from the communities he had once tried to keep at a distance. And even though he never publicly thanked Marcus, Richard became a silent part of the change, anonymously contributing to a fund that helped young firefighters follow paths that once seemed impossible to many. In the end, Marcus's story wasn't just about a rescue. It was about how a single act of courage can break down invisible walls, transform lives, and light the way toward a more just society. Because true courage isn't just about facing the fire. It's about igniting hope where there was once only darkness. And so, in the city of Charleston, as the sun set and the lights began to shine, a new generation found inspiration in that flame that never went out.